good few years ago, in student days, I wandered towards a place where heaven and earth had met in Rome. In fact, it's a place where on more than one occasion heaven and earth met in a supernatural way. It was Tre Fontane, in the area not far from the new Ur area done by Mussolini. There is one of the most ancient spots of Christian prayer. It's the place where, because it was a violent centre of training gladiators, St Paul was executed. The block where he put his head actually is still venerated, and we know from unbroken tradition, preserved in the very name, Tre Fontane, that 3 fountains sprang. His head bounced 3 times, and these came up. And so, Christians have always sought that spot, and that would explain things happening in subsequent centuries. There are different centres of intensity in the complex. Eventually, I went into the chapel, which is a church in itself, there, Scala Coeli, where, centuries later, one of Rome's visitors, Bernard of Clairvaux, went into ecstasy. The saint that we're feasting today is referred to as the Doctor Mellifluus, the doctor flowing with honey. Does that ring a bell? A name near here? Mellifont? Fount of honey. I'll come back to that in a minute. He was so called because of the way that he spent much of his time singing the praises of Our Lady. Well, she was not in any way going to be outdone in generosity, and she showered mystical blessings upon him. One of which happened, it would seem, there, where he, in ecstatic mode, saw a great cloud of souls through the centuries going up to glory through the intervention of that same Queen of Heaven. Scala Coeli, the name given thereafter to the chapel built, means ladder of heaven. But then it didn't stop there. I noticed in the grounds a statue of Our Lady, and underneath it this Ave Maria, and then a second line, Ave Bernarde. And I'd heard of that happening way back in information in France. At one time, and it would seem that it was there that it happened, when St Bernard was passing by a statue of Our Lady, he greeted her as he always would, Ave Maria, and the statue answered, Ave Bernarde. And on he went. This saint combined in his person several strands. On the human level, he was hugely magnetic and attractive. At the age of, was it 22, 23, he entered, but not alone. He had magnetized a great group of young people friends and people under his influence, young though he was. And one great discourse referring to St Bernard starts with these words, "Give me a man of 23, and on it goes." So it would explain the influence he had in a short time in the Novum Monasterium. Now the name given to that new foundation at Cito was the new monastery, and initially it was essentially just a strict Benedictine monastery that the abbot of Molem, Robert, had caused to exist. But for some reason he had to return, after founding it, eventually to his own house, possibly because his community was fairly keen on getting him back. But the good fortune of the foundation was that the first 3 abbots were saints. The second one was St Albéric, another Frenchman, and the third one, unexpectedly, was an Englishman, St Stephen Harding. So this was the beginning of what was going to be a massive movement which could not have been foreseen at the time. Why? Partly because this person came in and very early on showed therefore that his magnetism was such that he was the perfect man to make their first foundation. They made about 5 foundations in a very short time, the most important one of which was Clairvaux, and there he went with a band of men, and this became the fountainhead of extremely important foundations. He sent them to England and they landed in Waverley. It became the beginning of the huge floraison of Cistercian monasteries in England. He sent them to Wales, to Hyn Gwynardaf, I forget the English name for that, Whitland I think, in South Wales, and there that became the centre of great foundations throughout the country. And he sent them to where we are. Belifont is even closer to where I live than where you are now, and it's somewhere where I'd like sometimes, if I have a sister or whatever, a hermit living with me from Italy, to go and pray and feel time passing. In fact, one time I had a monk with me from Italy, a Cistercian. So we went there and we sang the ancient Cistercian Salve, which I still sing in the Hermitage, and the abbey, as it were, recognised it. They still sing it here, by the way, in New Mellifont. Salve, it's what's sung at the end of the day, very majestic. And tradition has it that the end of the Salve Regina, the Hail Holy Queen, was put there by St Bernard. That it would have stopped originally after the words, "Show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus." And then this bit, "O Clement, O Clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary," was added by tradition by St Bernard of Clairvaux, pushed by the Holy Spirit, and stayed there ever since. Then something else happened. The monastic community eventually there, which had gone on for centuries, was handed over to the Trappist reform. Now that is significant because all the houses in Ireland, Cistercian houses, are in the Trappist reform, as in England, the British Isles in general, I mean. And that came from not Cito itself originally, but from La Trappe, through what had been creeping in for a good while, the abuse of commendatory abbots. Abbots who were in an ecclesiastical career and had benefices but didn't go to their monastery. It was l'Abbé de Rancé, who had, it would seem, some kind of relationship with this lady who died suddenly. He visited her, and according to the story, because they couldn't get her fairly slender and tall body into the coffin, they'd cut off her head and put it beside her, and he had such a shock that he had a rethink. Whether that's true or not, we're not quite sure, but that's the story. What is true is that he was touched deeply by grace and realized, well, if I am abbot, I must go to my monastery. And he changed it completely. So much so that it became the strictest monastery on earth. And it was very interesting what happened there. My confessor Don Lucien, who was the prior of La Trappe, was the world expert on Abbé Rancé, and he would give us talks, inspiring talks, and he saw that his whole body of writings was a body which held together, c'est un tout qui tient, and it was a logical body. No one was ordained who entered, not ordained, therefore they only had people who were ordained before entering. It would seem that was the situation. So great was the emphasis on austerity and absence of study. The average lifespan was about 5 years because of the greatness of the penance. But he was extremely loved by his community. That we have the testimony of from contemporary sources. If the parents of one of the brethren died, it was announced in chapter that the father of a monk had died, the mother of a monk had died, but the person was not told, because the separation from the world was such that they were actually physically, morally, and spiritually dead to the world. It was a complete separation from anything but God. The silence was absolute. Indeed, we were still taught ourselves the sign language. There was a class a week, and we started with the words, and then eventually got to the sentences, and we all had our own sign. I was the frère novice chargé de la maison de la reliure, the book binding. So this was the way that one avoided having the voice heard in the cloister, and it was very efficacious. The only voice was that of the liturgy, and were, in the sense, the voice box was consecrated unto praise, which had a huge advantage, because we didn't even know the surname of the brethren next to us, nor their history. There was a certain aura of mystery around the brethren, which was not a bad thing. One met on a different level. There was love there, and very intense, but it wasn't banal. And the perpetual silence of La Trappe, which is, by the way, what Bernard would have wanted and had, is something which safeguards against a huge amount of leakage. Because even one recreation a week, if one has it, is damaging for recollection, and one starts to talk about the past and relive it. Total and perpetual silence is a hugely liberating factor. So this was what St Bernard had in mind, and it attracted. As forgotten in death as they are in life, brother knows not the heart of brother. And by the way, the houses right now in the Cistercian order, both those of the ancient order, non-reformed, and those of the reformed Trappists, the houses that attract and are doing very well are precisely those that keep these elements. A young Welshman not long ago has entered Heiligenkreuz, which is one of the non-reformed houses. It's in Austria. It's the one that actually Benedict XVI visited when he was in Austria. And they're doing extremely well. Got so many novices, they don't know where to put them. Everything is kept in Latin in that liturgy, and it's very full as regards the monastic discipline. In the reformed houses, the house that's doing best right now is Serfon, and they're doing so well they've been able to make a complete foundation in the old Czechoslovakia, which is doing very well as well. They've got French in the mother house, but they've kept the silence and the spirit. A very good house. The Lord is blessing them because they're honouring Him with coherence and fidelity. And in fact, I heard that when I was at La Trappe. Dont Etienne, who was abbot some years ago, had said, plus nous serons stricts, plus nous aurons de vocation. The stricter we are, the more vocations we'll have. It attracts. So I make a jump. All this would explain why Our Lady came back in our own time, really, to Trefontane. It was what happened when Bruno Cornacchioli was about to give a lecture against Our Lady, and also had a dagger with written on it, Morte al Papa, death to the Pope. A dagger that he bought with the intention of assassinating the Pope. He was there preparing his lecture in the shade. He wanted to buy some chocolates from Trefontane for his children. But the shop was still closed because of the siesta, so they started to play ball, and the ball got lost and looked for it there in the place opposite. And suddenly he couldn't find them anymore. He went to look for them, and he saw them there looking up. Bella donna! Bella donna! Beautiful lady, beautiful lady. He couldn't lift them, but eventually he also entered into ecstatic mode and was shown what they were seeing. And then it all happened. He was given a supernatural infusion of the whole Catholic faith. And also she talked to him, and he was able for the rest of his life to remember each word of the long conversation that they had, or rather lesson that she gave. And in it are some interesting points, notably the Catholic Church is the true church, and that the Pope is the Vicar of Christ. It was in 1947, and he was eventually to go to the Pope. And Our Lady helped him to find a priest that would take him there. So he went, and it was a private audience of a small group. And in the end, there was an invitation if anyone wanted to address a word to the Holy Father. This was the moment, and he did so. Went to him with the dagger, and with the inscription on it, Morte al Papa, and explained what he bought it for. Pius XII was not surprised. A year previously he'd been warned that this was going to happen, somebody was going to try and assassinate him, but it would be stopped by Our Lady. So he calmly accepted the apology and gave his pardon. Very soon the Vicariate of Rome approved the apparition, and it was made a place of pilgrimage, and it is much frequented now, and we can celebrate Holy Mass there. It's just opposite Trefontane, where the Apostle of the Gentiles lost his head, and where St Bernard went into ecstasy and saw the one he loved.